An analysis of sex work. Section. You can't reform violence out of a violent industry. You can only abolish it. You correctly state that most people in the sex trade, quote, are doing so in order to escape more punitive, low-paid work that may have stricter schedules prohibitive to people with disabilities, mothers, students, and many people who are primary caretakers for their families. End quote. Yet, for some reason, instead of abolishing the conditions that act as a pressure valve to push people into prostitution as a last resort, you instead opt to reform the sex trade itself. Prostitution will always retain its class character, offering scant benefits to those few at the top, while imposing its most brutal forms of expropriation and violence on those at the bottom. This is due to market forces and the laws of motion of capitalism. For classes to be eradicated in one industry would mean that classes would have to be eradicated within all of society. And if that were to happen, then the sex trade itself would cease to exist. We know this from 1. A historical analysis of the origin of the sex trade in the original appropriation of women's reproductive and sexual capacities as private property, and 2. From the withering away of the sex trade in actually existing socialisms. The sex trade under market forces will always result in the degradation of conditions for those trapped within it. You want to demand higher rates? Too bad. A woman from the lower strata of the sex trade will do it for cheaper. You want to demand safer conditions? A more exploited woman is available elsewhere, whether in poorer neighborhoods at home or abroad in the peripheries of imperialism. With the decriminalization of pimps and johns, the global sex trade increases. And with that increase, the market becomes saturated, and prices and conditions for prostituted women decline. Prostitution cooperatives also aren't the answer. Cooperatively owned and, quote, worker-run, they are still subject to the same competitive market forces, which inevitably lead to the same capitalist exploitation that workers experience in enterprises that aren't, quote, worker-run. We see the intermingling between the sex trade and imperialism best exposed in the sex tourism industry. As Maria Mies notes in Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, quote, the main export product, which, perhaps more than sunny beaches, has attracted streams of male tourists from Japan, the USA, and Europe, are Asian, African, and Latin American women, and that governments are offering their women as part of the tourism package. End quote. The commodification of prostituted women at home is visible in mainstream music, which talks of, quote, hoes, along with cars, high-fashion brands, and money as assets of social capital to be shown off to prove their wealth and dominance, while abroad is demonstrated by Western male fixation, quote, on cars and their exotic sex holidays, end quote. Which is so strong, according to Mies, that, quote, the governments do all they can to supply these two most important mass consumer goods at a fairly low price, end quote. The international sex trade can only be understood as the severe sexual exploitation of racialized women as a tool of capital accumulation. To think that you could end imperialism and the sex trafficking it produces through building power with unions, which is idealistic considering there is no, quote, boss in the traditional sense, is truly fantasy. This is part of the problem of the term, quote, sex work. Strippers might be able to organize a union because they have a boss and a workplace, but prostitutes do not. And considering you openly and for good reason oppose the legalization which would lead to bosses and brothels, the union organizing argument is therefore moot, Real power doesn't lie in forming loose associations to ask your abuser for slightly less sadistic abuse. Real power is the ability to crush your enemy, the bourgeoisie, the pimp, the John, the trafficker, in order to abolish the conditions causing your exploitation. In a literal way, we must crush their global market that sells and trades women and girls, and initiate a revolutionary movement demanding ambitious improvements to women's conditions. Calls for financial literacy as a solution to the ways that many of us are trapped in the sex trade is grossly misguided. And, quite honestly, solutions like, quote, banking are just insulting. Never in the history of capitalist exploitation has, quote, financial planning, financial literacy, or other victim-blaming approaches to poverty been able to actually end class oppression. By opposing the, quote, right to exit, but offering half-hearted, quote, solutions, you show that you are more concerned with protecting pimps and johns than defending women. When you claim that the only real legacy of chattel slavery is mass incarceration, you grossly downplay the impact of slavery on our society. Even a cursory survey of the transatlantic slave trade shows that the legacy of slavery permeates nearly all of American life, including but not limited to food service, tipping, domestic work, farm work, labor law, techniques of scientific management, technologies of surveillance, and yes, even the sex trade. Workers can organize unions to fight their boss. Slaves can only organize violent insurrections or escape their slave masters. There is a long history of documentation that pimps brand their women like slaves, utilize coercive and deceptive tactics to target children to traffic them, and enact the worst forms of violence to maintain control over the women, mostly women of color, that they prostitute. You cannot organize your pimp. You can only kill or escape him. Pimps and johns do not see us as human. Take the words of one pimp, quote, "Women are sitting on a gold mine. They got something between their legs that's like a commodity," end quote. This commodification doesn't stop there. There are entire websites devoted to slicing women up by body part, function, appearance, and the level of service to value her based on the ratings of johns. Far more detailed than a Yelp review, the Erotic Review, TER, and other, quote, escort review services dismember the woman into her component parts. Each part of the woman is meant to be reviewed, so you see rankings for information such as pussy, breasts, body type, breast appearance, youthful or older, and for transsexuals, even the amount and quality of their ejaculation, a phenomenon nearly impossible for trans women on hormones, yet nearly universally demanded by buyers. This is not something you can reform away. This is a natural consequence of commodifying human beings, specifically women. To deny that this sort of female dismemberment does not discipline the male psyche to dismember all of his potential sex partners, to judge and value them based on their component parts, is to be entirely ignorant as to how culture works. And to believe that these websites can be banned through reform is dually ignorant. These men already use text groups, independent websites, and Facebook groups to discuss and rate the women they buy. Prostitution thrives off reaction. It is ageist because of its prizing of young women who always age out at some point. It is ableist because it glorifies the able-bodied woman as the perfect form, while fetishizing or rejecting the disabled woman. It is racist because it thrives on the vulnerability of racialized and colonized women, values white women over women of color, and fetishizes black, brown, and Asian women. It is transphobic because it thrives off the vulnerability of trans women and fetishizes them. It is misogynistic because it teaches men that women are commodities to be bought at will, and because it rates, values, and pays women according to their attractiveness under the male gaze. You might argue that you are for the abolition of the sex trade, but only with the abolition of all, quote, wage labor. Yet such a, quote, negation through negation argument leads to a dead end. The same argument is applied to Israel. Quote, yes, the Israeli state is committing genocide against Palestinians, but all states are oppressive, so we shouldn't single out Israel. End quote. Such logic leads only to inaction by downplaying work we can do to save lives right now on the road to a broader social revolution. Far from attempting to preserve it, hoping the, quote, invisible hand of the market will regulate women into safer conditions, socialist feminists should instead attempt to smash the sex trade, along with every patriarchal vestige, in order to transform society and end gender and class oppression. End section.